Find a place where you can sit or stand without needing to do anything else. Somewhere you won't be interrupted for the next minute. Put your phone somewhere you can't reach it. Screen down. Notifications silenced. No music, no podcast, no video playing quietly in another tab. No talking, not even to yourself. For the next 60 seconds, don't try to relax on purpose. And don't try to think about anything in particular at all. Just let your eyes rest wherever they land. Let your breathing happen however it happens, without adjusting it, and let whatever ambient sound exists in the room, a fridge humming, a clock, wind against a window, simply be there without you reaching for anything to cover it. Don't count the seconds in your head. Just stay silent, unstimulated, for a full minute, and notice whatever there is to notice without trying to notice anything specific. From the outside, 60 seconds of silence looks like 60 seconds of nothing happening. No task completed, no information gathered, no measurable output of any kind. It's the closest thing to true inactivity most people ever deliberately choose. And yet inside your skull, across that same minute, something considerably more active than nothing appears to be underway. A shift in which parts of your brain are drawing the most metabolic resources. A change in the balance between two branches of your nervous system that spend most of an ordinary day locked in quiet competition, and a measurable easing of a background workload most people never notice their brain is even carrying. Most people assume silence is simply the absence of sound, a blank space where stimulation used to be. The evidence suggests something considerably stranger. Silence isn't an absence at all. It's an active neurological condition with its own signature that your brain rarely gets the chance to enter. Before we get into what your nervous system is actually doing during that minute, if the idea of a video that treats nothing happening as the most interesting part of your day appeals to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And a like here is a genuinely useful 2-second signal for a channel built entirely around content like this. Modern sensory environments are almost never actually quiet, even in rooms most people would describe as silent. Traffic several streets away, HVAC systems, refrigerator compressors, distant conversation, the electronic hum of devices left running, a phone that might buzz at any moment. The baseline sensory environment most people occupy for nearly their entire waking life carries a continuous, low-grade stream of auditory and attentional input that never fully stops. Your brain doesn't process this passively. A significant portion of its ongoing metabolic activity is devoted to sensory gating, filtering, at a largely unconscious level, which incoming signals are safe to ignore and which might warrant a shift in attention. The thalamus, often described as the brain's relay station, plays a central role in this filtering, continuously deciding what sensory information gets passed further into conscious processing and what gets suppressed before it ever reaches awareness. Here's the detail that makes this filtering work more significant than it sounds. The human brain accounts for roughly 2% of total body weight, but consumes something in the range of 20% of the body's resting metabolic energy. And a meaningful share of that consumption goes toward exactly this kind of continuous background processing, monitoring, filtering, and gating a constant stream of sensory input, most of which never becomes a conscious thought at all. This work doesn't pause when you're not actively paying attention to your surroundings. It runs constantly, in the background, the entire time you're awake, whether or not there's anything genuinely important happening around you. The common assumption is that silence is simply the removal of one input among many. Turn off the music, stop the conversation, and you're left with an unchanged brain minus some incoming sound. The evidence points to something more specific. Removing intentional external stimulation doesn't just subtract a source of noise. It changes what your nervous system has left to do, freeing processing capacity that was previously committed to filtering and monitoring. And that freed capacity doesn't sit idle. it gets reallocated. There's a familiar phenomenon that hints at how much of this filtering happens completely outside conscious awareness. At a crowded party, you can hold a conversation with one person while dozens of others talk simultaneously nearby, seemingly tuning out everything except the voice you're focused on, until someone across the room says your name and your attention snaps toward it instantly, even though you weren't consciously listening to that conversation at all. Researchers studying attention call this the cocktail party effect, and it demonstrates that your brain isn't simply ignoring the sounds it filters out. It's continuously processing them at some level, evaluating relevance, ready to interrupt your conscious focus the moment something crosses a threshold worth noticing. That background evaluation runs constantly in any sound-filled environment, whether or not anything ever actually crosses that threshold. And it has a real, ongoing metabolic cost. The first layer of what happens during that 60 seconds begins almost immediately, as the volume of competing sensory input drops, with less continuous afferent traffic reaching the reticular activating system and thalamus. The structures responsible for maintaining baseline arousal and filtering incoming stimuli. The overall level of physiological vigilance your nervous system needs to maintain begins to ease. This isn't a dramatic shutdown. It's a quiet reduction in the constant low-level scanning your sympathetic nervous system performs by default in an environment full of competing signals, each one a small, automatic question your brain has to answer. Is this relevant? Is this safe? Does this need my attention right now? The second layer unfolds as that reduced sympathetic load allows a shift toward greater parasympathetic, vaguely mediated influence. Stephen Porges, a researcher at the University of North Carolina, developed what's known as polyvagal theory, a framework describing how different branches of vagal activity regulate the transition between states of heightened alertness and states of calm, socially engaged regulation. Porges' framework remains an actively discussed and, in some respects, debated area within the broader field of autonomic neuroscience, but its central observation, that reduced sensory and social demand, tends to shift autonomic balance toward vagally mediated calm, lines up with more directly measurable physiological findings elsewhere in the literature. Luciano Bernardi, a physiologist at the University of Pavia, published research examining the cardiovascular and respiratory effects of silence specifically, finding that pauses of silence, particularly when inserted between periods of music or activity, produced measurably greater reductions in blood pressure and heart rate than even calm, slow music did on its own. The silence itself, not merely the absence of something more stimulating, appeared to be doing distinct physiological work. Porges' broader framework also describes what he calls the ventral vagal complex, a branch of vagal activity specifically associated with states of calm, safety, and social engagement, distinct from the older, more primitive vagal pathways associated with shutdown or immobilization under extreme threat. The relevance here is specific. The kind of calm 60 seconds of silence appears to promote isn't simply reduced arousal in a generic sense. It's more precisely characterized within this framework as a shift toward the specific vagal pathway associated with safety and recovery rather than any pathway associated with withdrawal or freezing, which is part of why brief intentional silence tends to feel restorative rather than merely blank or empty when people actually try it. The third layer is where this stops being simply a story about calming down and becomes a story about resource reallocation. Marcus Rachel, a neuroscientist at Washington University School of Medicine, was central to identifying and characterizing what's now called the default mode network, a set of brain regions that become more active, not less, when a person isn't engaged in a specific external task, historically misunderstood as a baseline resting state before Reichel's work reframed it as an active, as an active metabolically demanding network in its own right, associated with self-referential thought, memory consolidation, and internal simulation, Under normal conditions, competing for attention against this default mode network is the salience network, responsible for detecting and flagging potentially important stimuli in the environment, and the executive control network, responsible for effortful, goal-directed focus. In an environment saturated with continuous sensory input, the salience network stays persistently engaged, monitoring for anything that might need addressing, which tends to suppress default mode activity by comparison. Remove the external stimulation, even briefly, and that competitive balance shifts. The salience network has less to monitor, freeing metabolic and attentional resources that the default mode network appears to draw on more fully, engaging in the kind of internally directed processing, memory consolidation, self-referential reflection, loose associative thought, that a noisier environment tends to crowd out. There's a further, more tentative finding worth including carefully, rather than overstating. In 2013, Imke Kirste and colleagues at Duke University Medical Center published research using an adult mouse model, finding that daily periods of silence were associated with increased generation of new neurons in the hippocampus, a brain region central to memory formation, compared to periods of exposure to white noise or various types of sound. This finding comes from a mouse model, not a human trial, and no direct evidence currently confirms the same effect occurs in the human hippocampus under the same conditions. It would be inaccurate to claim 60 seconds of silence measurably grows new neurons in your brain based on this study alone. What it does establish reasonably is that silence specifically, not merely reduced sound intensity, has been shown in at least one well-controlled animal model to have a distinct, measurable relationship with a core process of neural growth, which makes it a genuinely interesting open question for human research, rather than a settled claim this video is entitled to make on your behalf. The engineering comparison here draws from two closely related fields at once: signal processing and computing. In electrical engineering, a persistent challenge in detecting a weak or subtle signal is background noise, any low-level, unwanted interference that competes with and can obscure the signal you're actually trying to measure. Engineers describe this relationship as the signal-to-noise ratio, and one of the most direct ways to improve it isn't to somehow amplify the signal itself, but simply to reduce the ambient noise the signal has to compete against. A faint astronomical signal is far easier to detect in a radio quiet zone, deliberately isolated from artificial interference, than in a busy urban environment saturated with competing transmissions, even though the astronomical signal itself hasn't changed at all. Your nervous system's internal self-referential processing, memory consolidation, interoceptive awareness, loose associative thought, functions similarly to that faint signal, present continuously but frequently drowned out by the ambient noise of ordinary sensory life, becoming measurably more detectable, more available, the moment external noise drops away. The second half of the comparison comes from how a computer allocates processing resources. Modern operating systems constantly run background processes, indexing files, checking for updates, managing memory, that compete for the same limited processing capacity as whatever task is actively demanding the user's attention. When active demand on the system drops, whether because a resource-heavy application closes or the device sits idle, the operating system frequently uses that freed capacity to run maintenance tasks it couldn't prioritize during active use, defragmenting storage, clearing temporary files, completing background updates. Nothing about the machine becomes less active during that window. It simply stops spending its limited resources on the loudest, most immediate demands and redirects them toward upkeep the system needed the entire time, but never had the spare capacity to perform. 60 seconds of genuine sensory silence appears to function as something close to this same kind of maintenance window for your nervous system. Not a pause in activity, but a brief redirection of activity toward internal housekeeping that a noisier environment simply never leaves room for. Extend this outward into how rarely a typical day actually contains a genuine 60-second window like this one. Background music while working, a podcast during a commute, a show playing while doing chores, notifications arriving throughout the day, conversation filling nearly every shared space. Most modern days are constructed, largely by habit rather than deliberate choice, to avoid silence almost entirely, often specifically because silence itself has come to feel uncomfortable, associated with boredom or awkwardness rather than recognized as a distinct physiological state with its own value. Some sense of scale helps here. Surveys of phone usage patterns commonly find that the average adult checks their device dozens of times a day, and each check, however brief, tends to re-engage the salience network's monitoring function rather than allow it to disengage. A day built around frequent brief interruptions, even pleasant ones, isn't structurally the same as a day with one long stretch of sustained stimulation. It's closer to a day with almost no stretch long enough for the shift this video describes to complete even once, since each new check effectively resets the clock before the reallocation toward default mode processing has had a real chance to develop. Two consequences of that near-total absence get consistently misread. The first is a persistent difficulty sustaining focus, often described as a shortening attention span, and blamed on willpower, discipline, or excessive phone use in the abstract. Part of what's actually happening may be closer to a salience network that rarely gets a break from monitoring competing stimuli, left chronically engaged rather than periodically permitted to step back, producing a kind of low-grade attentional fatigue that has less to do with moral discipline than with an environment that essentially never stops asking for a decision about what deserves attention. The second is a familiar experience at the end of a demanding day, lying down to sleep only to find thoughts racing, replaying conversations, drafting emails that don't need to be drafted at that hour. This is sometimes framed purely as stress or overthinking, when part of what may be happening is a default mode network finally getting its first real opportunity all day to engage in the kind of consolidation and processing work it couldn't complete earlier, precisely because the day never included a deliberate window quiet enough for it to happen sooner. The common explanation for both patterns treats them as separate personal failings, one a discipline problem, the other a stress problem, each requiring a different fix. Reframed accurately using the core mechanism this entire video is built around. Your nervous system doesn't become inactive during silence. It finally has the opportunity to reorganize itself without competing against constant sensory input. Both the daytime attentional fatigue and the nighttime racing thoughts may be downstream symptoms of the same underlying gap. A system rarely given even 60 consecutive seconds without something demanding a share of its limited resources. If a channel that's this careful about separating what's proven from what's promising is worth having in your feed regularly, subscribing keeps it coming without you having to go looking, and a like on this video is a small, direct way of supporting that kind of caution actually paying off for you. What 60 seconds of silence doesn't advertise is how closely it connects to heart rate variability, the same beat-to-beat cardiac flexibility measure that shows up throughout autonomic research as a marker of how readily a nervous system can shift between states. Bernardi's research on silence and cardiovascular regulation sits alongside a broader body of work, linking increased vagal influence of the kind associated with reduced sensory load to improved heart rate variability specifically, a connection that also touches on interoception, your brain's ongoing, largely unconscious model of your body's internal state. A nervous system spending less energy filtering external noise appears to have more capacity available for accurately tracking internal signals, heartbeat, breath, muscular tension, The kinds of subtle bodily information that a loud, demanding sensory environment tends to push below the threshold of conscious awareness. There's also a slower, more cumulative dimension worth naming. Richard Davidson, a researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who has spent decades studying emotional regulation and neuroplasticity, has documented how repeated practices involving reduced external stimulation and internally directed attention are associated over time with measurable changes in how the brain regulates emotional response, not simply how it feels in the moment. This doesn't mean 1 minute of silence today rewires your emotional regulation by tomorrow. It means the kind of state this single minute produces, repeated with any regularity, belongs to a category of practice with a documented relationship to genuine, durable neural change, rather than only a fleeting, momentary sensation. And that distinction between a one-time sensation and a repeatable, trainable state is exactly what separates a curiosity from a practice worth actually keeping. The evolutionary and historical backdrop here is worth naming plainly, because it's easy to overstate. Ancestral environments were rarely, if ever, completely silent. Wind, water, animal sounds, and human activity provided their own more or less constant ambient backdrop. What they reliably offered, and what most modern environments have specifically engineered away, was an absence of continuous, artificial, attention-demanding signal. No notifications, no algorithmically optimized audio, no environment specifically designed to compete for attention every few minutes. Researchers including Michel Levanquoyen at INSERM in France have examined how the brain's spontaneous, non-stimulus-driven activity behaves differently in genuinely unstimulated conditions compared to environments with even low levels of designed, attention-capturing input, suggesting that the relevant variable may be less about decibels and more about whether anything in the environment is actively competing for the brain's limited attentional resources. That last distinction matters because it points at something more specifically modern than noise itself. Ambient natural sound, rain, wind, distant birds, doesn't compete for attention the way a notification does, because it carries no implicit demand for a response and no possibility of social or professional consequence attached to ignoring it. A phone left silent but visible, or a text left unread carries exactly that implicit demand, which is part of why proximity to a phone measurably taxes attention even when it makes no sound at all. Modern environments haven't simply become louder than ancestral ones. They've become saturated with a category of signal specifically engineered to demand evaluation, a category that essentially didn't exist before the last few decades, layered on top of whatever ordinary ambient sound was already there. None of this means 1 minute of silence treats or replaces care for a diagnosed anxiety disorder, attention disorder, or sleep condition. And this shouldn't be mistaken for a substitute for appropriate clinical support, where that's genuinely needed. What the research does support, carefully stated, is that brief, intentional silence engages a measurable, biologically real shift in autonomic balance and network activity, distinct from simply reducing noise volume, and available to essentially anyone with 60 free seconds and a willingness to sit through them without reaching for a distraction. 60 seconds is short enough to attempt almost anywhere, which is part of the appeal. But a few specifics improve how reliably it works. Put your phone out of reach rather than simply face down beside you. Proximity alone has been shown in attention research to draw a measurable share of cognitive resources, even when the device stays completely silent and untouched. Sit or stand rather than lying down, since lying down tends to invite sleep onset rather than alert, quiet stillness, which shifts the exercise into something closer to a nap than the specific state this mechanism is built around. Let your eyes do whatever feels natural. Open, resting softly on a fixed point, or closed. whichever makes it easier to stop actively scanning your surroundings for something to look at. Don't try to empty your mind or force any particular mental state. The goal isn't blankness, and reaching for blankness is itself a form of effortful mental work that partially undermines the passive, unforced quality this state depends on. Simply let whatever arises arise, without following it deliberately and without pushing it away deliberately either. This works as a single 60-second event, but the research on cumulative, repeated practice, Davidson's work on emotional regulation among it, suggests the effect compounds with regularity rather than remaining fixed at whatever a single attempt produces. A version of this done once out of curiosity after watching a video, and a version done several times a day, built into ordinary transitions between tasks, are not really the same intervention, even though the instructions are identical. The nervous system responds to a pattern it can rely on, not a single unusual event it has no reason to expect will happen again. What weakens or nullifies the effect, checking the time repeatedly, which reintroduces exactly the kind of monitoring behavior this exercise is meant to briefly suspend. Using the 60 seconds to mentally rehearse a to-do list or draft a message in your head, which isn't silence in any meaningful sense. It's simply internal noise, replacing external noise, while your salience and executive networks stay just as engaged as before. And treating this as a performance to get right, since self-monitoring for correctness recruits the same networks the exercise is designed to temporarily relieve. If your mind wanders toward planning or rehearsing, noticing that drift and gently letting it go, without judgment or frustration, is closer to doing this correctly than achieving total, effortless stillness on the first attempt ever could be. Before we close, try the 60 seconds now if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments what the very first sound was that you actually noticed once everything else dropped away. Not what you expected to notice, whatever genuinely showed up first. There isn't much left to say about a minute of silence that wouldn't itself become a kind of noise, so this closing stays short on purpose. The nervous system doesn't announce when it starts to reorganize. There's no signal, no sensation marking the exact moment sympathetic gives ground to parasympathetic, or the moment the default mode network begins drawing more fully on freed resources. It simply happens, quietly, the way most of the important regulatory work in a body happens, without asking permission, without producing anything a person would notice enough to remark on, without needing to be believed in to occur. Which may be the entire point. A gesture this small, this available, this free of equipment or preparation or belief asks almost nothing of you except the willingness to stop briefly, asking anything of it at all.